Howdy, Dennis Bradford here. Let's think some about being, feeling, and doing better. What's the difference between becoming and being? Although Hume would call it a distinction of reason, it's actually a distinction beyond reason. It's not only impossible to understand conceptually, but it's almost always extremely difficult to apprehend non-conceptually, directly. Sages get the distinction. Non-sages don't. If you are wholly unfamiliar with the distinction, be prepared to be bent out of shape. The two domains are not distinct in the sense that being includes becoming, and yet they are distinct domains. Reality, existence, what is both becoming and being. For heuristic purposes, permit me to present them here as if they were simply two distinct domains. I'll do that by contrasting different qualities, attributes, characteristics associated with each. There's no standard terminology here. Please don't focus on the words. Instead, just try to get the main idea. Becoming is the domain of form, whereas being is formless. Becoming is the domain of emotions, whereas being is beyond all emotions. Becoming is linear, whereas being is nonlinear. Becoming is temporal, where some forms have duration, whereas being is non-temporal, eternal, timeless. Becoming is the domain of what is sequential, whereas being is the domain of what is simultaneous. Becoming includes what is finite, measurable or countable, whereas being is infinite, immeasurable. Becoming is the domain of duality and plurality, whereas being is the domain of unity, oneness. Becoming is the domain of the ego, whereas being is the domain of spirit. Becoming is the domain of the material, matter, bodies, stuff, whereas being is non-material, spiritual. Becoming is the domain of past and future, whereas being is now. Becoming is the domain of mobility, whereas being is the domain of immobility. Becoming is the domain of separateness and suffering, dissatisfaction, whereas being is the domain of oneness and non-suffering. Becoming is the domain of lust, whereas being is the domain of love. Becoming is the domain of thought, whereas being is the domain of no thought. Becoming is the domain of ceaseless flux, whereas being never changes. Becoming is the domain of relativity, whereas being is absolute. Becoming is the domain of conflict, whereas being is the domain of peace. Becoming is the domain of stress, whereas being is the domain of ease. Becoming is the domain of evidence, whereas being is the domain of self-evidence. Becoming is the domain of science, whereas being is the domain of the mystical. Becoming is the domain of what is audible, whereas being is the domain of silence. Becoming is the domain of the objective, objects, forms, things, whereas being is the domain of the subjective. Becoming is the domain of the describable, whereas being is the domain of the ineffable. Becoming is the domain of the perceivable, of sight and the visible, whereas being is the domain of vision and insight, of what is imperceivable and invisible. Becoming is the domain of force, whereas being is the domain of power. Becoming is the domain of attribute, quality, whereas being is the domain of essence, whatness. Becoming is the domain of desire, greediness, acquisitiveness, whereas being is the domain of fulfillment and inspiration. Becoming is the domain of the predictable, whereas being is the domain of the unpredictable. Becoming is the domain of causation, whereas being is beyond causation. Becoming is the domain of fact, whereas being is the domain of meaning or purpose. Becoming is the domain of effects, whereas being is the source. Becoming is the domain of birth and death, whereas being is the domain of life. Becoming is what is without, whereas being is what is within, Becoming is the domain of what is observed, whereas being is the domain of the observer. Becoming is the domain of either or, whereas being is the domain of both. Becoming is the domain of here or there, whereas being is everywhere. Becoming is the domain of parts, whereas being is the whole. Becoming is the domain of tension, whereas being is the domain of relaxation. Becoming is the domain of the incomplete, whereas being is complete. Becoming is the domain of illusion and delusion, whereas being is ultimate reality. Becoming is the domain of the secular, whereas being is the domain of the sacred, the divine, God, the spiritual. Becoming is the domain of hell, whereas being is the domain of heaven, the kingdom of God. As we've seen, the Buddhist tradition has hungry ghosts, devas, and so on endlessly circling hell. Buddhists often refer to becoming as samsara, whereas they refer to being as nirvana. Perhaps that's sufficient for you to have at least a vague notion of the distinction. Even if you do, what's as difficult to grasp as it is important is the identity of becoming and being. What appear to be two domains are really one reality. To thought, that seems a judgment too far. That's what makes it a distinction of reason, which really means it's beyond conceptual thought. It's more accurate to say that their identity points to a truth beyond discursive reason, namely that reality is beyond both becoming and being. In the next video, I explain why, at least initially trying seriously to grasp the becoming-being distinction is important for living well. Let's end emotional distress.